Sayego, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me. It is great to be broadcasting in New York City on WBAI. I will be doing a separate show for WPFW tomorrow on WPFW in Washington, D.C. So I'm all yours, New York. But I got a good show for you. I'm not sure how much. I'll have to pick some of the stuff up for DC tomorrow because I think I'm covering some stuff that I think warrants both markets to hear it. So let me just start. I'm gonna go into two areas. I'm gonna talk about a couple of essentially things that I posted on social media about um, comparing the abuses that took place in residential schools to much of what people are now outraged over between Epstein and of course Me Too and clergy sex abuse and all that stuff. One of my comments was that every boarding school, and this is U.S. and Canada, essentially were Epstein Islands, every one of them. And I think I want to talk a little bit more about that. But before I get into that, there's a lot of interesting conversations that come up about things like citizenship and birthright citizenship and uh, who's entitled to due process and all of these other things and the courts have dealt with these things over the years and oftentimes once you get to a place where you change a policy and maybe you amend the Constitution, you forget about how you got there. So I want to address two issues. One is the 14th Amendment, which many people regard as the amendment that freed the slaves. I want to put a little bit of a lid on that, and I want to talk about what the 14th Amendment really did and who it did it to. And then also want to talk about the Indian Citizenship Act, which is like 50 years later. So the 14th Amendment comes um, in what 1868, and the Indian Citizenship Act comes in 1924. So I want to talk about those two things. But before I can even talk about the 14th Amendment, I've got to talk about a ruling that his history has not been kind to, and for some very good reasons. And I'm talking about the Dred Scott decision. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Dred Scott decision, a lot of times we hear these cases thrown around, but we don't really think about what they really meant. What the Dred Scott decision affirmed, and it affirmed it both at the state courts and at the lower federal courts, was that it was never the intention for persons of African descent. It doesn't specifically say enslaved people, but that's what they're talking about. Persons of African descent to be U.S. citizens. So let me say it again. They affirm and they say it openly in the ruling that it was never the intent that black people from Africa, people of African descent. So it doesn't even if you're born in the United States, if you are of African descent, what the Dred Scott decision, what the Supreme Court ruled was, it was never the intent that you would be U.S. citizens. So no, you're not entitled. And again, I can't jump ahead to the 14th Amendment yet, where things like due process and who's entitled to what, equal protection, none of that stuff existed in at the time for the Dred Scott decision, which is only about 10 years before the 14th Amendment. It is in 1857. At this point, there is a clear distinction, kind of like what Trump brought up at his State of the Union address, that the role of government is to protect U.S. citizens, not people in the United States, just U.S. citizens, and and basically do whatever they want to immigrants or whatever else. That's not what the law says. I mean, when you take an oath in any form of government, and frankly, even in law enforcement, your oath isn't to protect American citizens. It's to protect the Constitution of the United States. And I'm not a big fan of the document. It's got a lot of things that are wrong with it. But to be clear, the oath that you take is about upholding the U.S. Constitution. It isn't about protecting U.S. citizens at the cost of others, especially. So, but that's not the way it's always been. Prior to the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court, again, 10 years earlier, has this Dred Scott decision, and they make it very clear. Now, only U.S. citizens And frankly, we can even debate who is a U.S. citizen. One thing is clear: in 1857, people of African descent were not considered U.S. citizens. The other thing is clear from the very beginning, and we can argue about whether it's still clear to this day, is that Native people were never intended. So even though the ruling in Dred Scott addresses people of African descent, I'm wondering about the language and the legal rationale there, that what they said was probably true at the moment. It was probably true. I mean, I think people may have been outraged, and that's what brought about the changes that would lead to the 13th and the 14th Amendment. But it didn't change things for Native people. And in fact, the 14th Amendment still excludes Native people. And I'm going to get into some of that. So okay, you know what the Dred Scott decision is now. And basically the whole case stems from a black man, Dred Scott, who was in Missouri Territory. I don't even think it was a state yet. It was about to be admitted as a state or something. And it was going to be considered a slave state. And he was brought by his owner to, I think, Illinois or one of the other states that was considered a free state, and then he was forced to go back to the other state, and he argued that once he entered a free state, his freedom should have stuck, and that's what he argued and managed somehow. Of course, he didn't really. They ruled that he didn't have standing, and all kinds of other stuff. There was all. I mean, he was dead on arrival into the Supreme Court. But those were the arguments that he made, and the ruling was real clear about how the judiciary, how the Supreme Court, and frankly the lower courts, they were just concurring with the lower courts, how they viewed people of African descent. Again, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I understand that you had never had the intention of people of African descent being U.S. citizens, but you also never had the intention for Native people. So we'll just kind of keep that off to the side here for now. So then, a decade goes by, and they, the Civil War, they abolished slavery, essentially, and they passed the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment has some things that are stated very, very clearly. People still don't seem to understand it. I mean, the fact that you got guys like the President of the United States and people in Congress who don't know that everybody is entitled to due process by virtue of the 14th Amendment. And I'm going to read it. So, I mean, the section I'm talking about is not very long. It's easy to follow. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they shall reside. So it's not really a granting. It is a declaration. It's saying if you're born in the United States, or if you've been naturalized, which is a whole other process, but if you're born in the United States, regardless of who your parents are, if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. So they're just saying it's flat out. It's not an offer. It's not a grant. It's not an option. And of course, if you were among the formerly enslaved, or the people that were referred to in the Dred Scott decision, your choices are either to remain as property, and even if you live in a quote unquote free state, if you get dragged somehow into a slave state, you're going to become property. It's not going to hold for you, and that's only a decade before the 14th Amendment. So that's what the 14th Amendment says. It says flat out, you are a citizen of the United States if you're born there or naturalized. But it goes on. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor, and this is the part that some people just don't seem to understand, nor shall any state deprive any person, not citizen, any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of law. So, I mean, it's really clear. There are protections and immunity privileges for citizens, but there's also in the 14th Amendment, they talk about all persons. And again, they're talking about persons subject to the jurisdiction. They still aren't talking about us. But even, frankly, um, it still does, in a way, refer to us in terms of being um, having the right to due process. But again, um, that 14th Amendment goes on to talk about um, enumeration, because remember, black people were counted as persons for congressional representation and for taxing purposes, mostly to give the state, the southern states, the slave states, more power than they were entitled to based on their citizenry. So an enslaved person, their body could be counted at 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation and taxation. But they still weren't citizens. They weren't 3/5 of a citizen, and they didn't enjoy any privileges from that other than whatever financial resources came or whatever representation would come their state's way. But obviously, if you're property, you don't have any privileges. So the other part of the 14th Amendment addresses the enumeration, the appropriations part, to correct that 3/5 compromise. So they basically say everybody's counted. Everybody's counted, excluding, and it says this in the 14th Amendment, excluding Indians not taxed. Now, going back to the first part of it, where it said anybody born or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. If you were considered Indians not taxed, you weren't subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's what that Indians not taxed means. It means that you were a distinct people. Of course, we were always a distinct people before the U.S. Constitution, and that's why the U.S. Constitution makes it very clear that we are not being counted. We're not being included. We are a separate, distinct, original people whose existence is not being shaped or controlled or subjected to the U.S. Constitution. It could not be more clear. So even though the Dred Scott decision makes it very clear that in 1857 the country had no intention of making any person of African descent a U.S. citizen. They didn't think citizenship applied to a person of African descent. And that's true even in the free states, though, now, mind you. So, I mean, even if you were a black man or a formerly enslaved in a free state, it still didn't mean you were a citizen. So I just want to make this stuff clear, because when we look at things through the lens of today, we always think that there's just natural progression of rights being extended, and we hit a milestone and then everything was roses. No, that's not the way it was. That's just not the way it was. So so we get to the 14th Amendment, and again, that's 1868 that this changes, and it's after the Civil War, after the abolition of slavery, and that's what becomes the new law, which basically is including the formerly enslaved, those of African descent, and it includes any person that is in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction. And of course, it's not just Native people weren't. I mean, if you were a diplomat from another country, you could be in the United States and not necessarily subject to to the jurisdiction of the United States. So I just want to be clear, that exclusion wasn't just about us. There were other people. But if you were an immigrant, legal or otherwise, undocumented, and keep in mind, there was no documentation. The whole idea of citizenship and immigration papers didn't exist. So this was this is what is interpreted as birthright citizenship. So if you're born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. Now, Trump is trying to suggest that doesn't necessarily apply to immigrants. What it doesn't apply to, even in especially in 1868, it still didn't apply to Native people. We were not U.S. citizens in 1868. We were not declared or made U.S. citizens by the 14th Amendment. We were excluded from those provisions of the 14th Amendment, with the possible exception of being entitled to due process. That's still debatable, because even though we're not U.S. citizens, we're still persons, and we could argue whether somebody who is fully under the jurisdiction of the United States is entitled to due process or not. That might be an interesting conversation to have. Now let's fast forward in about 50 years. We get to 1924. Now in 1924, there was an attempt to solve what they thought would ultimately solve the Indian problem by just addressing, because part of the issue that was coming up was who's responsible for these people. I mean, if there's like health, education, and certain housing, certain annuities that are due to these people because of treaties, who has to pay that? I mean, there was a debate. I mean, sometimes the states, New York State was covering it for a while, and they said, wait a second, it's unlawful for us to pay the federal government's responsibilities due to treaties. So this law, the Indian Citizenship Act, was actually written up. It was drafted out of by a New York congressman, a guy by the name of Snyder. It was called the Snyder Bill at first, and he was trying to solve the quote unquote Indian problem. So his solution was, well, let's just make them all citizens. So in 1924, the Senate and the House passed the Indian Citizenship Act, 1924. And just to be clear, the first line says, an act to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to issue certificates of citizenship to Indians. That's the opening line. Now, I got to tell you, I didn't know any Native person with a certificate of citizenship issued to them by the Interior Department. So if that process actually existed, I've never seen, and I guess I could do more research and see, let me see one of these certificates. What did it even look like? And how many years was it issued? Because we could argue, in the absence of that certificate, regardless of the declaration, because there's a proviso in here, and I'm going to get to that. Because let me read what the law says. It said, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States be and they are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not in any way impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal or other property. Now we'll keep that proviso a little bit on the side here. So to be clear, this wasn't. It refers to it as a grant later, but it's not a grant. It's a declaration. I mean, this is imposed. This is an imposition. Because again, let me go back again 10 years prior. So a person who was of African descent and who was really quite possibly subject to enslavement, certainly in certain states, and who was not a U.S. citizen and didn't have the privileges or the immunities, as discussed in the Dred Scott decision, that a citizen had, they went from that existence to having citizenship, again, declared. It says you are a citizen. If you're born here, you are a citizen. Or if you've been naturalized. Now, I don't know how many people of African descent were in the United States in 1868 that weren't born in the United States, because you have to understand, slavery was an industry. They call it chattel slavery because they had stopped importing slaves. In fact, the importation of slaves from Africa and even from South America was illegal. Now, I'm not saying there weren't people that were being dragged in, and they were. I mean, we know that some of the last slave ships, some of them that were, again, fugitives from justice, and there's stories of some of these ships that were sunk, and both the slaves and the crew died, and all this stuff. But so in 1868, I don't know how many of people of African descent weren't born in the United States, and I don't know what the process looked like for those who may have not been born in the United States to have become naturalized. That's not detailed here, and I'm sure somebody could do that research. But they went from this existence of potentially being enslaved, certainly not being a U.S. citizen, certainly not having the privileges of due process or any of that stuff. They essentially could be victimized without any recourse. They had no standing in court, none of that stuff. They went from that to, in 1968, having U.S. citizenship placed upon them. Now, the one thing I want to be clear, that doesn't mean freedom. Let me say it again. Being a U.S. citizen does not make you a free person. It subjects you to the laws and the Constitution and law enforcement and all this other stuff associated with the United States. That's what being a U.S. citizen does. It makes you part of that process. You are an entity of the government for all intents and purposes. I want to be clear here because people when I hear people say, "Well, I'm Mohawk. I'm a citizen of the Mohawk Nation. I don't call myself a member." No, I don't call myself a member, but I also don't call myself a citizen. Why? Because citizenship implies a relationship with the government of a nation. That's what it implies. So all these formerly or these people of African descent, effective by the 14th Amendment, were now subject to U.S. citizenship. Now, I want that to be, hold on to that. Now move, again, fast forward 25 years or 50 years to the Indian Citizenship Act. What were Native people before 1924? We were original, free, and independent peoples. Now, I'm not saying that we weren't subject to a lot of racism and abuse, murder, all kinds of stuff that was still happening. Look, but that was all criminal, even when it was the government doing it. Now, they could justify it in many ways, just like with the Dred Scott decision, to say, well, if you weren't a U.S. citizen, you weren't entitled to protection, so we could do whatever the hell we want to you. And that's what they did. That's why Native people were, first off, let me bring this up, because I'm going to bring it up again later. Native people were enslaved. There was an emphasis more on enslaving Native women than Native men. And it's not because Native men couldn't work. We weren't as easily controlled because women were abused. They were sexually abused. They were used as breeding stock. Look, all those slave ships that came from Africa and even from South America, they weren't filled with women. They were filled with men. So in order to take those men of African descent and put them into the chattel slavery industry, they needed to breed with some. Now, there were clearly many women of African descent that were here and that were already, bred into this system, and some were imported. But Native women were used almost as broodmares. So, here's what Native women were subject to. They were subject to not only being enslaved themselves and being forced labor out of them. They were used in the chattel slavery industry as broodmares, but they are also subject to the pleasure of those who claim to own them. The abuse of white men, basically, not just their owners, but people who had control over them. So I just want to make that clear, because and I'm not saying Native men didn't go through any of this, but women were more targeted because they filled a specific need in the chattel slavery industry. Nobody talks about this, by the way. It is mentioned in the film Rumble, How Indians Rocked the World. I encourage you to check that film out if you haven't. But it's mentioned in there. But it's not talked about anywhere else. The role that women played in the U.S. chattel slavery industry, and not because they did it willingly either. So I want to make mention of that. But so women were being persecuted in that way, and they weren't being protected because they weren't U.S. citizens. They weren't of African descent. But from a legal standpoint, the United States couldn't claim to have subjected us, or subjugated us, I should say. So on paper, we were still a free and independent people. Now, I'm not saying we didn't live in harsh conditions because of colonialism and settler colonialism and imperialism. Because, as I've mentioned before, the whole idea of colonization and imperialism by the United States the whole system operated outside of any of the legal ramifications associated with the U.S. Constitution. What they did in terms of settler colonialism and imperialism defied all of their so-called rules of law. It was based solely on their power to do it, their authoritarian rule. So I talk sometimes about Maggie Blackhawk, who wrote a piece that was in the Harvard Law Journal, I think, where she talked about the small c constitution of imperialism and colonialism versus the large C Constitution of the United States, and how they didn't mix, and they were not compatible. I mean, they were absolutely not compatible. She tries to suggest there might be ways to make it compatible, but frankly, I'm not buying it. So, in 1924, when Native people were declared U.S. citizens, again, we didn't go from being an enslaved people or a I don't know a kidnapped people brought and subject to this stuff. I mean, many of us were in our homelands, but we went from that to being subjugated under the U.S. Constitution in 1924. That's what citizenship meant. Citizenship, again, just like it didn't mean freedom for people of African descent, it didn't mean freedom for Native people either. Quite to the contrary. It became one of the means to try to control Native people, because now the United States could claim that we were U.S. citizens, whether we wanted it or not, because there's nothing in even the proviso that I mentioned at the end, which I'll bring up again in a second here, that doesn't suggest that we had options here. But again, let me reiterate what that actually said. It said, again, we are declared to be citizens of the United States, provided that the granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal or other property. Well, that's an interesting thing. So, in other words, even with the United States declaring we were U.S. citizens, they couldn't claim our land. At least not by virtue of making us citizens, because they put that proviso in there. Now, the other question is, what is our property? And I've asked this question here on the show before. Is our labor something that we own? I mean, is that a property? I mean, we can think about tangible goods, but what about income? If I work and somebody pays me, is that money mine? Because nothing in this granting of citizenship, as they said, or this imposing of citizenship, was supposed to affect any personal or tribal property. Now, we get into debates today about whether Native people who receive some sort of disbursement from gaming enterprises, whether that's taxable. Well, certainly if you are being given an annuity check monthly, quarterly, or yearly from the gaming revenue of your nation, isn't that tribal property that you're being granted? Not from the federal government. So how can the United States claim to tax that? They tried to create a couple of loopholes where we could say, well, we call it the General Tribal Welfare Exclusion Act. If there's certain things that you get as a tribal benefit, we're going to put that into a separate box that's not taxable. But we're still going to say everything else is taxable. So there's language even in the Citizenship Act that begs some questions about, okay, so we are declared to be U.S. citizens provided we're not impacted by any of this stuff. Well, what if we are impacted by it? Are we still U.S. citizens? Is it imposed upon us? Because here's the thing. I still come back to the place that says, no, I get a choice in the matter. You can't just declare I'm a U.S. citizen. I have say. I have agency. You can't just make me yours. You can't just claim me as a subjugated cog or piece of your governing system. No, you can't do that. And you even included a proviso that raises a lot of questions. So, I think it's important that people realize, and I say this because today, it's only been 100 years. It's only been 100 years since they passed this thing, a little over. 1924 to now. And the vast majority of Native people don't know that they can reject that U.S. citizenship. They don't know they can. And in fact, many, you're going to hear Native people say, well, we were made, we got to be U.S. citizens in 1924. No, you didn't get to be. It was shoved on you. It was imposed upon you. The question is, did you throw it off? Did you reject it? Because that's the other thing I get asked. I get asked all the time. He says, well, have you renounced your U.S. citizenship? No, I didn't renounce it. I'm claiming that you didn't have the authority in the first place. And I don't have one of those citizenship documents from the Interior Department that says I asked for or I accepted it or that it was ever even done. So again, I think we have to be careful about how we use things like American citizenship as this, this pathway to, the land of milk and honey and this glorious thing. Look, I get it. There are people who come from really tough situations, including slavery, and a lot of abuse, a lot of oppression, who have come to the United States hoping they would be granted U.S. citizenship or some legal status. So whatever they were leaving, and let's be clear, people have been leaving their homelands for half a millennium. That's how this whole thing started. Pilgrims, Italians, Polish people, Irish people, you all left your homelands. And I'm not saying it wasn't justified. Chinese people, Africans, I mean, look, after the slave trade, there were still an awful lot of people coming here from Africa to avoid the tyranny that they left behind. They didn't fix it back home. They didn't fix it in Spain. They didn't fix it in England. They didn't fix it in Germany. They didn't fix it in these places. No, they came here believing that there was enough flexibility and enough freedom in the U.S. system, especially if you were white, that you could fit in and make a meaningful life for yourself. Still retain a certain cultural identity, but first and foremost, you are Americans now. Well, that's not what we had. This was shoved down our throats. We're already here. And for those of African descent, they didn't come here. Those people, who were granted citizenship or imposed citizenship upon them in 1868, they didn't come here willingly. Now, granted, I know that there were people like Frederick Douglass that was all about trying to become the best damn Americans anybody could possibly be. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of Frederick Douglass. Why? Because he saw the pathway for affluence for black people was getting a piece of all the lands they were taking from Native people. He advocated for it. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of that logic. I mean, he was colonial. He was a settler colonist, just like all the white folks were. He just wanted a piece of it. That's what he wanted. So I have to say that. So I wanted to address this. Now, I didn't come to any real firm conclusions here. I just stated some facts. I just want people to understand that neither the 14th Amendment nor the Indian Citizenship Act was a gift. I said it before. There were no parades when they passed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. Our people were not celebrating in the street. We were not being invited to parties and posing for photo ops. No, it was opposed. It was rejected, especially when draft notices started showing up for the Second World War. Then our people said, "Wait, oh, hell no! You can't recruit us, force us to enlist, forced conscription." Our people already enlist in that stuff at a higher rate than I'll frankly ever understand. But the idea that you could force us and draft us into your military because of this citizenship thing you did, no. So I wanted to make that clear. All right, now I want to get into my to the discussion that I started on Facebook and other places. I made a couple of posts. One of them was that I went on to say that every boarding school And somebody said, "Well, we got to include Canada." Yeah, I mean, when I said boarding school, I'm talking about what Native people experience, regardless of that imaginary line drawn between white men that they call the Canadian-U.S. border. Every boarding school was an Epstein Island. Now, I know people are automatically going to say, "Yeah, but there wasn't rich, affluent people going there for sex parties." Look, let's be clear. Pedophilia is less about pleasure than it is about power. Rape is less about pleasure than it is about power. And this is a widely known thing. But somehow, when you have somebody who traffics children, like Jeffrey Epstein did, or like Hollywood moguls like I can't even think of the guy's name right now, but the Me Too movement guy, the I that I'm drawing a complete blank. Anyway, but yeah, so these people are treated as if they were providing pleasure for themselves and for the people that they were subjecting women to. So that's still not pleasure, it's still power. And I'm not saying that there weren't perverts within the boarding schools who weren't pleasuring themselves with Native children, girls and boys. They were. But it was still about power. The abuse that took place. I mean, look, we hear about, even the accusations against Trump. He not only had sex with little girls, but he struck them. He beat them. That's one of the stories out there. Now I realize it's just an allegation, but see, that's what it is. It's about power. It's not just about pleasure. I mean, I suppose in some twisted way, a man striking a little girl, some twisted way, that man may have gotten pleasure out of that. But for the life of most of us, I hope we can't see that. But the abuse that took place in these boarding schools, we're talking about thousands and thousands of kids. So here's the other post that I put. I said, the Me Too movement, Harvey Weinstein, sorry. I knew it would come to me. The Me Too movement with Harvey Weinstein and others, the Me Too movement, the clergy sex abuse scandal that's rocked the United States, Boston, Chicago, Buffalo, all over the place, and everybody whose name or body person shows up on Epstein Island or in the Epstein files. If you add all of those people, all the victims together, you still don't even come close to what Native children experience in boarding schools in U.S. and Canada. I mean, I'm not saying that people didn't die in these circumstances, but death and murder isn't widely discussed in terms of Me Too, clergy sex abuse, and the Epstein files. No, that's not widely discussed. I'm not saying it didn't happen, and we know some people have died, unceremoniously and suspiciously since then, for a variety of different ways. Now, the clergy sex abuse that took place at residential schools, which is clearly still clergy sex abuse, there was murder involved. There was death. There was injury. There were physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, all of that stuff. Enslavement. Those kids were slaves. They were forced to work. So, and this is the problem that I have with folks like Deb Haaland, who did this as she was going out the door from the Interior Department, signs off on this report on residential schools, which was grossly undercounted. It was grossly, and I would say maliciously, diminished in terms of its scope. The atrocities. Yeah, I'm not saying she didn't mention atrocities, but the scale is not captured in her report. I mean, the numbers that she said are confirmed are so small that it's laughable. Now, keep in mind, there were about 150 of these schools on the Canadian side, and 4 to 5 times that many in the United States. Especially if you count the privately, the church run and church funded, and the state run and state funded schools that sat along the federal program of Indian boarding schools. There were lots of them. And we're not talking about tens of thousands. We're probably talking about hundreds of thousands of children. I mean, we're talking about 150 years here. I mean, if it were just a couple of years, you could say, well, yeah, it couldn't have been that many kids, really. It only existed. I mean, the Carlisle Indian School only existed for a little over 10 years. Yeah. Well, the system existed for 150. 150 year 150 150 years. So the scale of abuse that took place over 150 years is so significant. And again, I'm not trying to play oppression Olympics. I get accused of that sometimes when I say, look, they don't even compare. I'm not trying to say that we need to put these things on a scale. But I'm just saying, if you're outraged by the Me Too movement, and you should be, if you're outraged by the clergy sex abuse scandals, and you should be, if you're outraged about this whole cover up that's being attempted by the Trump administration on the Epstein pedophilia racket, and you should be, if you're outraged for the victims, if you're outraged by the power that has been demonstrated by those who were the perpetrators, and you should be, I got to ask, where's the outrage on what happened to Native kids for 150 years? 150 years. Because they don't compare. I'm not saying compare them. I'm saying they don't compare. The scale of what Native children, and let's be clear here, this wasn't about making money. I'm not saying money wasn't made. You know, look, the churches got paid from the federal government. The federal government did an assessment, and they determined that for only 100 of those 150 years, that adjusted for inflation, the federal government appropriated $23.3 billion to operate these schools. They paid people. These were congressional appropriations. That's what the total is from. Deb Haaland did that. Now, that's not the quantity of the harm that was done to Native. That's just how much they paid to commit the crime. So, yeah, there was money involved, but not Jeffrey Epstein kind of money, where he was just raking in donations to fund what he was doing. I mean, the guy bought a Caribbean island, for crying out loud. He bought politicians, princes, royalty. So to be clear about whatever scale you want to put to the magnitude of Jeffrey Epstein or the clergy sex abuse scandal, and look, you want to talk about some magnitude? Think about the settlements that came from that the Catholic Church had to pay up. But on average, the Catholic Church was paying between almost $250,000 per claimant. Per claimant. $250,000. And some got much less than that, but some got much more. Millions of dollars. For being abused, sexually abused. Not for the death. There was no deaths here. We're not talking about murder. We're not talking about ending somebody's lineage by killing them. Look, we're talking about our parents and grandparents. Well, some of the people who died never got to be parents and grandparents. Their lineage ended at residential schools. They died trying to leave. They died because they were murdered. They died because of neglect and abuse. They also died because of historical trauma and alcoholism and so many other things that were bred into them by this abuse. There were women who were sterilized, who basically were rendered barren. So their lineage stopped too. They weren't murdered, but this idea of eugenics, we're going to take the full bloods, and we're going to make sure all the women can't have children anymore. Now, why the full bloods? Well, because look, the half breeds they've already mixed race, so they might be able to be incorporated into the melting pot. But we don't know about those full bloods, so let's just end it with them. We're gonna give them all hysterectomies. We're gonna make it so they don't bear children. That's one of the boxes they get checked that make residential schools genocide. And again, let me say it clearly: the causing of death with the intent to destroy a people is genocide. the 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 harm, physical, social, sexual, psychological, the injuries that are inflicted upon a people with the intent to destroy them in whole or in part. That's genocide. Even if they're not dead, even if they weren't killed, if you've committed the kind of physical and sexual and harm to these children, to these people, to these human beings, even though they're children, that would destroy them as a people. And keep in mind, this is all tied to assimilation, right? This is all about trying to break them. The third overt act is creating the conditions that would cause a people to no longer exist. Assimilation, indoctrination, ridding of language and culture, the idea of stripping away identity, the ethnic cleansing of the. This is where part of that kill the Indian, save the man thing, it has the is regarded as a metaphor. Well, we don't really mean kill them. We mean kill that part of them so they will survive as in the human condition rather than the savage condition that they had before we did this to them. Of course, kill the Indian, save the man isn't just a metaphor. This is one of my quotes where I say metaphors don't require graveyards, and these schools all did. So that's three of them. The other two are sterilization, the deliberate interference with the ability to give birth, with childbirth. So sterilization of women, which didn't just happen at schools. These were happening by Indian Health Service throughout the entire Bureau of Indian Affairs. The entire Interior Department was involved with eugenics and the idea of sterilizing Native girls in particular. And of course, the final one is just the literal taking of children from their homes, from their culture, and placing them in the custody of another people. That's the definition of genocide. And any one of those five things is genocide. And all five of them took place at these residential schools. I know I've said this on previous shows, but I'm trying to make a point here because I understand the outrage, and it's justified for what Harvey Weinstein and others did that was addressed or is still being addressed with the metoo movement. Look, we still have missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and boys and others because of this idea of human trafficking. That didn't go away just because metoo happened. It still exists. So just to be clear, I don't know how much clergy sex abuse still occurs, but I know one thing: I wouldn't trust my kids around church staffers. No, I wouldn't. And we know that there are schools, including universities, sports programs, and everything else, where girls are always being abused. So we know that stuff still exists in institutions that may or may not be tied to the church. And of course, this Epstein stuff is still, we still don't even know what we don't know yet. So one of the things that I tried to point out, and as people suggest that the Trump administration is destroying democracy, I always have to get back to this point. The United States was never established to be a democracy. The founding fathers they abhorred democracy. They felt like an ignorant electorate or citizenry would destroy a country. So we can't allow the majority to rule. That's why they have a representative government, right? And that's why only certain people have the ability to really vote and elect. That's why the Electoral College exists. I mean, that's why all of this stuff, that's why you have gerrymandering. That's why you have, every state with 2 senators regardless of the population. And that's why you had the 3/5 compromise and all those things. They were all about rigging the system. Totally anti-democratic. And if you don't believe me, Trump's first term, he won the Electoral College vote, but lost the popular vote. So clearly democracy didn't exist. But even if it did, the idea that 50% plus 1 can dictate what happens to 50% minus 1, and understanding that how do you affect those people? Wealth. The people with money can buy democracy. They can buy court rulings. They can buy judges. They can buy politicians. They can buy everything. Little girls, little boys. They can buy everything. They can buy immunity from prosecution. And they certainly can buy a majority. And that's why you have so many people that still support Trump, that support him against their own interest. The wealthy have always controlled this. I have to remind people that Thomas Jefferson had children with a woman that he had enslaved, that was a slave of his. And that woman was his wife's much younger half-sister. So that means that Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law, his wife's father, his slave's father, also had sex with slaves and children with slaves. This was a second generation, and we don't know how far back this goes. But you know what? The Boys Club was okay with this. Because not only did women, and I included Native women in this, not only were they subject to being used as broodmares to continue the chattel slavery industry, they also got used by their masters. They were raped. Because if somebody claims ownership of you, if you can't say no because you are property, no matter what anybody wants to say about Sally Hemings, she was raped by Thomas Jefferson. Her children were still slaves. Ultimately, some of them were freed, I guess. But they were born into slavery because this was the second generation of Sally Hemings' family that was raped by their masters. That's power, that's perversion, that's corruption, and that's no accountability at the highest levels. There's no repercussions if you rape a little girl like Thomas Jefferson did or his father-in-law did. Somebody you kept as a sex slave on the side while you got other labor out of them. So I want to be clear here. White privilege has always dictated what happens in this country and still does to this day. 1% controlling almost all of the wealth, controlling all of the power, the courts, the judiciary, the legislature, the presidency, all of it. It's not new, folks. The system was designed this way. It's not broken. It's built this way. I'm John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. I am not a U.S. citizen. I reject the prospect of it. I reject the imposition of it. And I just want you to know, as you listen to Resistance Radio, this is one of the things that I am resistant to. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for joining me on this program. I want to thank you for joining me each week. And I do encourage you to support WBAI and WPFW. And if you listen on any other affiliate, support those programs as well, those platforms as well. I'm John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. Nyahweh.